welcome to the IAS's first public lecture in this academic year, given tonight by John Sutton. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rob Barton. I'm a co-director at the Institute of Advanced Study and co-director of Social Science. And it's my honour to introduce John to you tonight. So, John Sutton's many things. He's a philosopher, cognitive archaeologist, director of the Macquarie Centre for Elite Performance, Expertise and Training, fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities, current member of the Australian Research Council's College of Experts, emeritus professor in the Department of Cognitive Science at Macquarie University, and of course, interdisciplinary par excellence. And you only have to look at his website and read the strapline on his website to appreciate that. Where the aim is stated as to be to build connections between cognitive science, philosophy, psychology, sports science, and the social sciences. His publications include 3 authored books, the first published in 1998 on philosophy and memory traces, Descartes to connectionism, and the second 2, which I think are in production at the moment, on cognitive ecologies, skills, histories, emotions, and porous memories, distributed ecologies of memory. He also has an incredible interdisciplinary range of papers in journals of philosophy, cognitive science, psychology, and literary studies. But to those who, unfortunately, enough not to know this work, his eminence is very obvious from the various posts and fellowships that he's held. For example, visiting fellowships at UCLA, Edinburgh, UCSD, King's College London. He was the first president of the Australasian Society of Philosophy and Psychology, and he's previously received Macquarie University's Outstanding Teacher Award. And John is, as we'll see tonight, no pressure, a great communicator. And as you probably have divined from what I've just said, he's particularly interested in memory and skill, in theories of memory, and in embodied and distributed cognition. These are the ideas that the mind is inherently grounded in the experiences of the body, and that it extends out into the world through its interactions with it. I think you might hear a little bit about this perspective tonight. So he's bringing these interests and expertise in memory, embodied and distributed cognition to the IAS major project that's running this term on representing memory. And speakers can always change their title between giving it to you and then putting it on the screen. I'll just let you read it from John.
Thank you so much for that, Rob. Can you hear me okay at the back speaking like this? And Rowan, you'll give me a shout at the levels. Okay. Thank you all for coming out on a kind of evening when it's getting proper cold, as they say up here. Some of you have come very far indeed, some from across the sea. Thank you. And I want to just begin with a couple of thanks. Thanks so much to Rob for the kind introduction and for his work with the Institute of Advanced Study. Thanks especially to Alex Easton, who's here, who brought me here to work on the Representing Memory project, which is going great guns with it. Thank you, and to the Institute itself. Most urgently, for now, in this beautiful space, thank you to Hatfield College and to the Master and the Climate, who is very kindly housing me and my partner Christine Harris-Smythe, who's here with us. We're having this wonderful time, and it's so extraordinary to be able to speak in a place like this and absolve us all of our sins. So thank you for tonight and for the term. I also just want to thank, because I will probably run out of time at the end, all of my collaborators in a whole array of different fields who have fed into the work that I'm going to be pulling together tonight. I will hit my stopwatch and try to keep roughly on track. Isn't this a beautiful space? I mean, we should have more of such events like this. A mother is talking with her child, who's just turned 4, about an unusual event. It's a big fireworks celebration. It's the only one this child has experienced. The two share some memories of the event, and the mother asks if any other people they knew were there. The child goes, David? The mother says, no, he wasn't. Yes, he was. Oh, says the mother, he was. But we didn't see him, did we? The child says, no. The mother is helping her child see the difference between personal experience and other sources of knowledge, to discriminate, we might say, true remembering from just knowing, to interpret some mental states as derived from visual or other direct personal experience, while others come from testimony. From what David himself perhaps later said about having been at the same fireworks. Although it's unlikely, the mother is instructing her child, marking and instilling norms for giving an account of the past. Now this unexceptional but revealing conversation was recorded in Dunedin, New Zealand, as part of extraordinary long-term studies of the development of autobiographical memory, or in the more modest and neutral term that I'll use mainly, personal memory, by Elaine Rees and her colleagues. Studies that started in 1996 and continue still with many of the same mother-child pairs, with the youngest infants who were then 18 months old, now aged 24 or 25. This is a unique kind of big science, right? It's really different from the use of expensive technology like the beautiful Meg, the magnetoencephalography brain imaging machine that sits across the hall from my old office in Sydney. It's protected from fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field by squids, like super quantum conducting interference devices. Now that's super impressive, right? It's wonderful big neuroscience, but to do Elaine Rees's work in Dunedin on memory development, the psychologists have to manage and motivate and retain infants and toddlers and then later adolescents, in this case for 25 years and counting, and make science and theory out of ordinary conversations about the past. Right? Sometimes the human sciences can be really, really hard. In the case of that conversation, there was no experimenter in the room. The mother was, of course, aware they're being recorded. Now, Rees and her colleagues find mothers and fathers and other carers too, but they mainly work with mothers, shaping their child's memories and their understanding of what memories are and what they're not, in ways that vary quite reliably over time as the child gets older, but also very intriguingly across contexts and cultures and families. Now, some of this mind shaping, as we can call it, is more explicit, involving meta-memory judgments about the norms of remembering. Yes, it's harder to remember things that happened longer ago, or, no, you just imagined that. You're not really remembering it. Much is just built into the ordinary social and cognitive and emotional work of helping kids soak up a grasp of the passage of time and of the place of their own experiences and memories in it. So I'll come back to these processes of enculturation into memory practices. But now from Dunedin back here to Durham briefly before we're off again. So this chapel, I believe, was built by 1854, right? And some of you know a fair bit about the people who did that, maybe why. And some of you will have some sense of how they lived here then. Right? Now that period is well beyond the reach of personal memory, our topic tonight, and of what's sometimes called communicative memory, the span of the 3 generations or so in which we typically hear stories of the personal past from our grandparents if we're lucky. Beyond that, we're in and between the realms of cultural memory and of history. Then your cathedral was built, I believe, by 1133. Wow. So if studying and trying to feel one's way into the world of those who did that is challenging, a tantalizing encounter with those people 900 years in the past, then just think, the task of the Neolithic archaeologist is much more thrillingly uncertain, going back beyond any written history into deep history. So let's go. Çatalhöyük is a Neolithic site in central Turkey. It was first excavated in the 1960s, and then for 25 years, from 1993 to 2017, by a team based at Stanford, led by Ian Hodder. It's another remarkable form of big science. Now we're here at just over 7,000 before the Christian era, 9,000 years ago rather than 900 with the cathedral. Çatalhöyük was an early site of large human development, with a population of maybe 3,500 to 8,000 people at its peak, occupied for probably 1,200 years or more, from about 7,100 BC on. Right? Way longer than the time from the building of the cathedral to today. Çatalhöyük had unique social and architectural features, with stratified sequences of densely clustered houses built on top of each other, over generations and centuries on this mound, typically reproducing the floor plan on the same footprint, and with many burials beneath house floors. So, with two other cognitive philosophers, in 2017, I was called in by Ian Hodder to talk with the Çatalhöyük Research Project team, a hugely impressive, amazingly diverse group, about mind and cognition, memory and self. We were due to meet at Çatalhöyük in the midst of their last summer of excavation on site, but due to political uncertainty, a late shift was made to Cambridge. Not only am I not an archaeologist, but sadly I haven't yet been to Çatalhöyük. But these digs have produced wonderfully detailed archaeologies of the unique material culture of the site. Here's just a couple of examples. Their earlier cross-disciplinary inquiries had addressed demographic, economic, and ritual features. Now, I've long worked on memory, on how social processes and material culture, as Rob said, operate together in complex ecologies of remembering. And Hodder's ambitious program for this meeting was to assess any evidence for historical changes in cognition, or creativity, or self, in archaeological traces of, for example, intensified trade and exchange, in patterns of metrication or standardization, in changing technologies, or in forms of abstraction in artistic and symbolic production. This last one is famous because for many years the 60s archaeologists saw and believed that it was an actual map, a cartographic, geographic map of the town itself, with the representation of the local volcanoes that you can see from just along from the site. But it's almost certainly a leopard skin with just an abstract pattern rather like the other ones. In the project meeting proposal, there was, as you can see from this book title, a lot of use of the C word, consciousness, which as always I wanted to avoid. So instead, I had to engage with Hodder's invitations to consider evidence about selves in and over time. For example, burial practices, attitudes to body parts and bodily integrity, the nature and treatment of figurines, personal adornment, the patterns of wear and use and repair of some personal artifacts such as pendants. I was a bit uneasy with Hodder's references to possible greater awareness of an integrated personal self over the Neolithic in general, or the 1200 years of the Çatalhöyük settlement, as well as concerns about the directionality of that language. I worried that Hodder was using a dichotomy from anthropological theory that might not help us, between the distributed, fragmented selves, sometimes called individuals, of more collectivist societies, and the integrated individuals of modernity. But of course, that's not a zero-sum game. I mean, we're all, on many views, distributed selves, unevenly spread across our bodies, our air, our land, our people. If there really are modern myths of wholly detached, rational individual autonomy, then we really have never been modern. And some people, of course, in reverse, can be as integrated as you like, even when fully, wildly, socially entangled. Now, I'm no enemy of grand narrative, as you'll see, but I am wary of that seductive genre which has our more porous, disassembled, embodied, embedded, entangled ancestors repeatedly replaced and displaced by more bounded, integrated, private selves, repeatedly in Neolithic Çatalhöyük, in Bronze Age Britain, in Homeric Greece, and again in Renaissance or early modern Europe, repeated. So the cognitive change that I wanted to countenance was more specific, more grounded, more continuous. The looseness of fit between evidence and hypothesis that shadows cognitive archaeology is much more troubling when the target is as nebulous as consciousness. Facts about material traces of beads, bricks, bones, or walls may be clear enough to everybody without settling anything about that. So I turned from consciousness and self to memory, a topic on which Hodder had also already developed distinct and ambitious views, and on which perhaps the shape of hypotheses that link artifacts with possible practices might be visible. The Çatalhöyük evidence as a whole, Hodder had written, gives many indications that indeed people began to link themselves to specific pasts, by burying pots, tools, humans, and hunting trophies in ways that indicate particular memories, rather than a generic reference to a group. So, forms of remembering emerged or consolidated at Çatalhöyük, the claim is, that weren't routinized and habitual, nor merely traditional and generic, and forms which took as their objects neither repeated activities nor widespread factual knowledge. Rather, the new forms of social memory were, as Hollow put it, conscious, specific, and commemorative, as household groups began to make specific connections between the present and the past. So I've put these claims, which are more than striking enough, right, against independently motivated issues about personal memory. Again, I'm not an archaeologist, but I hope for mutual benefits in confronting it with the contemporary interdisciplinary sciences of memory. So that's where we're going to. So the first question is, what would personal memory need to be the kind of psychological capacity which might change in the Neolithic? First, I'm going to consider the evolution of the basic systems involved, and then I'll back up to sketch a framework against which it might make sense to treat some changing socio-material settings as sculpting and retuning cognitive capacities like personal memory. So, many non-human animals can track what happened, and when, and where, and are sensitive to durations and rhythms and cycles. Both the basic molecular mechanisms and the systemic neural circuitry of such basic event memory may be fundamentally conserved, at least across avian and mammalian species. There are lively experimental, methodological, and conceptual debates, some of our colleagues here take part in them, on how, for example, scrub jacks and rats are sensitive to time. We can accept that our basic memory mechanisms are deeply ancient, in place way before the advent of anatomically modern humans. Those long-standing forms of event memory likely integrated sensory imagery and the affective salience of past events, and generalized to, or just were, basic forms of foresight too, consideration of future events. Then, before and in and soon after the emergence of Homo sapiens, these memory capacities developed further, though much is unknown about the sequence and the functional demands. Richer forms of episodic memory emerge as that basic event memory integrates with a causal grasp of the past and the future, with more complex forms of foresight, imagining the future, or imagining events that might have or might happen. And perhaps with awareness of the location of self and events in time, often now called mental time travel, though that metaphor can mislead. And there were associated changes in working memory, executive control, in how we understand other people, in our metacognitive ability to monitor and think about our own mental states, perhaps in some narrative and linguistic capacities. We just don't understand how all these relate to each other. For example, whether recognizable episodic memory developed before or alongside or not until after human language. And all of those puzzles are my topic tonight. I'm happy now to accept that the suite of flexible and integrative cognitive capacities in anatomically modern humans included fairly sophisticated abilities to track events and sequences, to imagine and plan at least some kinds of future action, and perhaps to consider alternate possibilities, that's maybe less clear, but also incorporating links that are familiar to all of us between emotion and imagery and past or future experience at a direct and visceral level. So, those memory capacities we can accept are likely in play as far back at least as 120,000 years ago or so, perhaps way more for some of them, a bit less for others, but long before the gradual, slow developing, but dramatic enough changes in lifeways and in social organization that mark the later Paleolithic period and then the Neolithic, as we come down under 12,000 years ago, down to Çatalhöyük, 9,000 years ago, around 7,000 BCE. So, it would be hard to base a case for any later Neolithic changes in memory and cognition, long after any significant changes in brain size or brain structure, on a claim that those basic elements of episodic memory were not yet in play. So that's not the strategy. So, what lessons should we draw about the history and the archaeology of personal memory? Well, one option would be to insist that while human memory has a biological history, of the kind I've just sketched, it has a cultural history in a very thin or minimal sense. If memory was already fully formed way before the Neolithic, then any historical changes in in the practices and activities of remembering, let alone in the social or material supports for memory, look like merely curious variation, just ethnographic window dressing or cultural froth on memory's real internal, neural nature. On that view, there are no genuinely cognitive ecologies of memory, shifting and varying across historical or deep historical time, because memory and cognition are behind culture, or maybe outside culture. On such a view, the archaeology of anatomically modern humans too is of merely humanistic and casual interest to true memory scientists, right? The people who study the neurobiological capacities as they exist now, and have since their earlier biological evolution. So, I want to say no surprise. Two lines of thought suggest that that is not the only or the right set of lessons to draw. We can accept the consensus I sketched about core elements of human memory while still allowing substantial variability in the development and the deployment of those elements in cognitive practice. So, first, we need to raise the bar a bit on our conception of the relevant psychological phenomena, the personal memory capacities we want to explain. So in its full form, autobiographical memory integrates our memory of events and episodes with much else in the mind, for example, with my knowledge of myself and my life, my personal semantic, personal factual memory, and with the more or less coherent, more or less overlapping narratives that I might tell myself and others about my life. Then there are twists in the way that we understand and inhabit time. We're not just affected by past events. We're not just sensitive to durations and rhythms. We also think about particular past and future events as occurring at specific time. We can sometimes fallibly track specific event time pairings. We have fallible capacities to distinguish one specific event at its unique time from other similar events, and to distinguish, again, fallibly, remembering from imagining, and what I remember myself from what you or David might remember and report. The fallibility of all these capacities is vital, right? These are cognitive achievements. They don't come all that easily to us in particular cases or as general capacities. So I'm not going to be suggesting that our more distant ancestors couldn't or didn't remember specific past events in these ways too, or that these are ways that are better or more advanced in terms of being in time. What I suggest, based on neuroscientific and developmental research, is that they do not, these capacities do not just automatically arise with and from those basic memory capacities that came with our genetic and neural inheritance alone. Rather, we have to knit together or deploy those capacities, what Cecilia Hayes calls a biological starter kit. We have to deploy them in certain ways, on developmental timescales and then in transmission through cultural rather than biological evolution, to elicit the reliable outcome, the capacity to track specific events in the past. Secondly, then, to state boldly the framework views which Rob referred to, which I don't have time to argue for tonight, but we'll be happy to discuss. Memory is scaffolded or distributed across complex cognitive ecologies. Human brains are plastic and incomplete. They're prone to construction and selection and pattern transformation. They're open to shaping by conditions, by artifacts, places, and activities which we ourselves, individually and collectively, partly create, shape, and regulate. Our brains are situated in and nested in wider cognitive ecologies of disparate elements, neural, bodily, social, and material elements and resources that are themselves tangled in webs of mutual dependence. So just as there's a looseness of fit between cognition and material culture, which is the space for archaeological inference, so there's a looseness of fit between mind and brain, between cognition and the brain. That's the space for an expanded psychology. The activities and practices of remembering, as of feeling, of sensing, problem solving, and so on, are often on this view not located in the brain alone. They're hybrid, they're spread across brains, bodies, and worlds. Humans are epistemic engineers, iteratively constructing cultural and technological cognitive niches. That's a phrase from the philosopher of biology and archaeology, Kim Steroli. And he writes later, in arguing that cognitive archaeology and embodied and scaffolded cognitive theory can be mutually beneficial, he writes, if thinking depends on doing, and on the world in which the ancient is embedded, ancient thinking is tightly linked to ancient activity. Much knowledge, he says, is know-how, and know-how is manifested in actions that leave physical traces. So, ancient lifeways are not just effects of hidden internal cognitive processes. As intelligent agents, then, we are cultural and technological by nature. We're natural-born cyborgs, in Andy Clark's phrase, always adapting to cognitive ecologies which we have ourselves engineered. So there's space and need for history and archaeology in cognitive science, just because mind and memory incorporate social and environmental resources differently across distinctive contexts. Now, there are clear cases that I think are more widely acceptable than the views I've just outlined, in which historical and cultural and technological changes that occurred long after the advent of anatomically modern human brains did transform or restructure human minds. Literacy and complex numeracy emerged in the course of history. Deep history, for sure, though almost certainly at least a wee bit later than Çatalhöyük. In each case, reliable and repeatable neural and psychological changes result as people come validly and effortfully to learn to read and write and to compute more complex mathematical functions. In these cases, pre-existing neural mechanisms are adapted or extant. They're reused or redeployed to subserve these new culturally driven functions. And then many subsequent changes in media, technologies, and practices continue to shape and reshape brains and minds, operating in close coupled interaction with simple systems and other technologies and devices, which themselves change dramatically over these thousands, though not, in this case, tens of thousands of years of cultural history. So, my suggestion is that some other aspects of human cognition might be a little more like literacy or complex numeracy than we typically think. A focus on the constructive nature of remembering, imagining, and simulating past, future, or possible events is pretty much ubiquitous in the contemporary sciences of episodic and autobiographical memory. First, at a neural level, some central dynamic circuits involving the medial temporal lobe and other parts of a default mode neural network may be necessary to bind and to index and to coordinate memories and to generate other simulations of experience. On some views, remembering is simply one way of imagining the past. Components of the medial temporal lobe, like the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex, which are studied in wonderful detail by my Institute of Advanced Study colleagues here, these are vital, but they don't work in isolation. Other distinctive neural processes are involved in personal remembering in practice. Sensory, spatial, scene building, self-other, emotional, motivational, linguistic, narrative, kinesthetic systems, often involved in retrieval of memory, past events. Neuroscientists are increasingly aware of substantial individual variability in the ways these systems knit together. Just one example is the effects of deficits in visual imagery, or aphantasia in the extreme, when people's still functioning memory capacities are significantly altered by not being able to recall in sensory detail or visual details of past events. But that's just part of a wider array of variation in memory experience than we had until recently expected. That expanding research on individual neurocognitive differences is as yet poorly connected with distinct traditions of work on cultural differences in the ways children come to remember the past, which I'll come to in a moment. Now, the extent of that constructive processing described in the sciences of memory can seem to loosen our grip on the past. No matter how much overlap there is between constructive past thinking and constructive future thinking, neural overlap, psychological overlap, experiential overlap, personal memory is still different, right? Because it makes claims on the past. And despite its imperfections, it's recognized as making claims on the past. Our human forms of personal memory are also implicated in constructing and navigating identity over time. Self and memory, on many views, are, of course, in mutually sustaining relations. But also, memory is required for grounding temporally extended emotions, which we track over time as they change and as we change with them. So all of those roles that memory plays in connecting present and past ground its cultural importance, its moral importance, from promises and contracts to legal responsibility, from our practices of loving and grieving, to our shared urges to bear witness to past injustice, to specific events in the past that we want to be able to track. While we also deploy memory for many other things, many things other than tracking the past accurately, we do want, when need be, to be able to distinguish what happened from what was imagined or merely wished for, to distinguish what I experienced directly from what I learned through testimony, and what happened on one specific occasion from what typically used to happen. On the one hand then, the basic components of our memory and simulation systems are constructive, they're future-directed, to the extent that it can become puzzling to work out why we ever accurately remember specific past events at all, rather than just how things tend to go. But then, on the other hand, much of modern life seems to depend, both personally and socially, on our capacities, fallible as they are, to track the past more or less accurately. So the developed, modern, mature, enculturated personal memory, in other words, is set up to achieve or to approximate forms of source monitoring, of tracking and policing the sources of our mental representations. Forms which are challenging, to say the least, given our dynamic neural inheritance. But we manage these challenges. We don't really think about them. We manage them culturally, collectively, individually, partly by setting up stabilizing, enduring external systems, technologies, institutions, to buttress and support our naturally constructive memory. We rely on other people, but we also train up our own inherited cognitive systems, knitting them together so as to be able better to latch onto, to exploit social and worldly scaffolding of the type I mentioned, to tune them, to tune our own capacities to attend in the right ways to memory processes, or to the metacognitive cues which help us fallibly, again, pick out the sources of our images, our feelings, our beliefs, our thoughts. Our images of the past, our representations of the past, just don't come marked with their sources clearly and definitely tagged. They're not time-stamped. They're not color-coded by their origin. We often have work to do in assigning them to a source, whether it's in past personal experience. Like, I saw David at the fireworks, or from some other channel. David told me he was at the fireworks. I really wanted to see David at the fireworks. And we use lots of cues to do this, some non-conscious, some effortful. Cues like the plausibility of what we seem to recall, or the fluency with which it comes to mind. So those processes of discriminating and interpreting our own mental states typically operate post hoc, after the fact, after the constructive generation of these event memories themselves, these event representations themselves, before we've decided if they're memories of them. And we use those cues, again fallibly, to mark certain distinctions, to identify some representations as cases of personal memory and not others. But these attribution processes have had to develop, right? They're trained up, they're enculturated, they're transmitted through development and by cultural learning. So personal memory, the speculative idea is a distinctive way of thinking that's made of old parts. It's another cognitive gadget, to use Cecilia Hayes' term, a cognitive assemblage transmitted by social learning, rather than a product of genetic mutation. Different training regimes sculpt our modes of attention to memory processes. They sculpt new deployments of metacognitive and experiential cues, and we internalize the norms of remembering, coming to be able, fallibly, again, and then with the help of this extensive, ubiquitous social and technical scaffolding, to be able to track the precise sources, to keep some grip on complex cross-temporal interactions. All this is to say that as children, we learn to remember. We learn the skills of remembering the personal past in slow and multi-staged, variable processes of enculturation, which involve many distinct cognitive, affective, interpersonal, and narrative resources. The ways that children come to remember past experiences and to imagine the future are culturally and socially scaffolded. Enculturation then, in turn, transforms our inherited capacities to track isolated events and episodes. Along with other dimensions of cognitive development, social interaction shapes children's emerging capacity for joint attention to the shared past. It shapes the gradual emergence of their richer understandings of time, which take a long time to develop into adulthood. The norms, practices, and abilities that ground spontaneous personal memory soak in from and through the child's social and cultural setting. As a result, there's substantial variation with regard to children's memory in just what skills are learned and in the ways they're deployed. Cultural differences have been studied much more thoroughly today than gender differences or economic or even individual differences. But significant influences of all these kinds are likely. The mechanisms of early scaffolding are diverse. They go well beyond the child's differential acquisition of language and her local narrative norm. Emotional dynamics shape memory from the start, as do the rhythms of embodied interaction and local norms about interdependence or morality. Children come to acquire specific styles of reminiscence, for example, more or less elaborative, more or less self-focused, more or less emotionally involved, and so on, in complex interaction over time with their adult carers and with their peers. So, longitudinal and developmental and cross-cultural studies like those by Elaine Rees I mentioned in Dunedin, some of which were done in collaboration with Durham researchers, or by Chi Wang at Cornell, for example, they will demonstrate mutual influences of parents and children on each other's memory practices. They show surprising long-term effects of the microprocesses of communication. Effects on the ways, for example, that children come to divide up narratives or episodes into distinct events, how they set event boundaries in different contexts and cultures, and on the particular kinds of coherence or lack of coherence that are apparent in the ways that adolescents and young adults think of and tell their life story. So to summarize this idea, the enculturation of human memory is developmentally slow. It's uneven, even where it does deliver more or less stable outcomes. A cognitive archaeology of memory, then, needs to probe ways that memory capacities might have been harnessed and shaped in particular historical circumstances. Were there relevant changes in the constraints for identifying and linking past events more precisely, or in attributing experiences to the right sources? Now, hypotheses about cultural change in the Neolithic need to be modest. This isn't just my nervousness about possibly speaking to archaeologists here, but I do believe it. Any such change will have been gradual, uneven, incomplete, variably implemented, multiply caused, and multiply instantiated. It will have been less a single rupture or a decisive transition than an array of entangled and partial shifts. So, in considering interrelated background conditions for change, we must see features of Neolithic lifeways as coexisting with older practices and commitments rather than decisively replacing them. You may have read recently about this book by Wenger and Graeber, based on earlier work they've done. They posit extensive periods in which economic, including Neolithic periods, in which economic and political arrangements, which might look incompatible to us, alternate or operate together in the same social groups. For example, across or between more egalitarian and more hierarchical social ecologies, in what they think of as a deliberate collective exploration of a range of possibilities. So, we're not looking for one-way historical transitions. Any cognitive change in the Neolithic, long after significant changes in the human brain, was responsive to and entangled in an array of environmental, economic, and technological developments which were themselves unevenly distributed. To repeat, sophisticated forms of human memory, in terms of the effective tracking of events, do long predate the Neolithic. Across the later Pleistocene, even as hunting and foraging lifeways became more complex, our hunter-gatherer ancestors could deploy flexible embodied memory and a capacity for increasingly high-fidelity transmission of skills through apprenticeship learning. They could deploy memory for generic, repeated, and typical events, and some ability to deploy environmental features and artifacts, portable or fixed, for mnemonic purposes, perhaps in the recall of important factual or semantic information, perhaps as curated by specialists. But at the same time, hunter-gatherer lifeways may not have required tracking the sources of event knowledge quite so precisely. In our worlds, as I've said, such demands are met partly by social and technological scaffolding, and partly by our capacities, sedimented in from early childhood, at least in cultures roughly like ours. Our capacities for discriminating certain cues, certain signs of representations that derive from specific personal experience. But perhaps hunter-gatherers did not need, or need so often, or need so much, those specific narrative memories of unique experiences, which we sometimes now simply think of as memory. Among smaller groups of hunters and foragers, many experiences were shared. Many actions were joint actions. Information tended to be mutually available and easily shared. Trust was built and maintained over histories of interaction involving strong social emotions. Events and sequences were relatively predictable and rhythmic. The choices and decisions made in many contexts brought fairly immediate returns. So, systems of mutual cooperation, when resources are typically shared on the spot, as Sterling notes, require less stringent mechanisms for tracking other individuals, tracking other people over time, for checking on their generosity, say, or for policing their reputation. Much practically and socially significant information and know-how could be left out in the world, partly out there in place, to be accessed again when needed, as those with the relevant history came around those same parts of the environment again. Now, my further suggestion on top of that is that this form of cooperation placed significantly different demands on memory, too. Perhaps these hunting and foraging ancestors had less of a need to sharply distinguish information arising from personal experiences from information deriving from others. First-hand experience from second-hand experience, what we call memory, from what we call imagination, or what we call testimony. There were maybe less pressing demands for epistemic vigilance in such small civil societies. Now, a view of this kind has been defended by Eva Blanca, biologist and philosopher. So Eva says that at a period before modern forms of memory emerged, quote, an individual's memory of her own specific role in a group event was less distinct than it is for individuals in modern societies. In such settings, not only was recollection spurred on by others, but other individuals could contribute to the recall of the event that the individual had experienced. So Jablonka bases this case on the highly constructive nature of our biological memory, as I sketched earlier, and says, well, in these earlier periods, there was less need to compensate for, to scaffold around the naturally constructive, promiscuous processes of human remembering. That compensation, that scaffolding, was provided by more or less stable social worlds and ecological support. Monitoring and epistemic vigilance did not have to be internal, individual, or individualized. The component resources of human memory did not have to be assembled or deployed in ways which cleanly distinguish different sources. Again, I'll just quickly chime two notes of caution. It may well still be that some very vivid, very powerful, perhaps emotionally intense personal memories were retained separately, perhaps in ritual events, maybe more like trauma memory than the kinds of memory of particular past events that I've been talking about here. The equipment was there. Secondly, to go back to Wengrow and Graeber, this isn't the picture of a kind of classically primitive social intelligence, ascribing that to early hunters and foragers. I mean, they rightly caution against depictions of early Homo sapiens as what they call effectively or stereotypically childlike, living the only lives they were able to imagine. Their point bites rightly against, for example, James Woodburn's description of immediate return economies as so strongly oriented to the present that they're characterized by a lack of concern about the past and the future. That seems too strong, too linear. So the point isn't that there was a single shift or a maturation from forms of remembering typical of the childhood of men, something these guys are rightly opposed to any new sophisticated modern capacity. Rather, just as there are lots of overlapping hybrid socioeconomic systems, so there were and are many possible ways of turning the diverse, interacting, cognitive and affective components of our human ways of being in time, as we adapt more or less effectively to dynamic environments and social demands. So, to get to my point, if there's anything to my claim that these various features of memory did not always need to be knitted together in quite the same way, then our next step is to ask if new conditions might have introduced different pressures to track the past more precisely. So, one big change in demographics and lifeways in the Neolithic, and at Çatalhöyük in particular, which might have altered demands on personal memory, was expansion in group size. As Sterling and Hawkins put it, in larger groups, social worlds were less intimate and less informationally transparent, and the expectation of repeated interaction was less secure. Right, populations were up to 8,000 people at the peak at Çatalhöyük, so you didn't have rich shared histories with everybody. There was a world of virtual strangers, as it's been put. So group cohesion and commitment aren't kind of automatically maintained. Then moving from demography to economy, we can note requirements of more delayed return systems with farming and domestication. Right? With agriculture, working the land, you have to track what you've done over months, over seasons, over years. Now at Çatalhöyük, there's no sign of private property, right? Or of the restricted ownership of resources in very fluid household units. But still, there's a need for more temporally extended resource management, planning across the longer investment horizons. changes in mind, I went back to look at existing hypotheses in archaeology about pressures on memory in the Neolithic. For anybody who's interested, I've got things to say like Trevor Watkins' ideas and Richard Bradley's, but I'll just skip again to Ian Hodder's claims about history houses and burial practices in Çatalhöyük. I try to find, how to shape a more specific hypothesis about changes in memory. So Hodder saw the house at Çatalhöyük as a new kind of site for social memory. This is specific memory, as I said, directed at particular objects or people. Hodder distinguishes social memories which were general and site-wide from the kind he's interested in here, those which linked a specific past to a specific present. What's the evidence for that kind of claim? Well, there's a number of burial disturbances within the sequences of layered or stacked houses that were multiply rebuilt at Çatalhöyük over many generations. In some were found concentrations of unique and differentiated symbolisms, and in some there's evidence for accurate retrieval going down, accurate retrieval of objects or sculptures or installations from lower, older layers. And in particular, sometimes a person who'd been buried down there was drilled down and extracted, usually just the head of a particular person. Usually a person who'd been treated differentially at burial. So Hodder argues these retrieval practices demonstrate precise memory of individuals and locations over decades, or sometimes going down a couple of layers. There were clear memories, he says, within house clusters of the exact location and significance of the burials beneath the platform's floors. So again, I went back to look, well, what would that mean about personal memory in what Hodder calls the emergence of greater temporal depth at Çatalhöyük. I'll just show you something I've been looking at most recently with this. These have long been called tokens in Çatalhöyük and in other Neolithic sites. They're small clay balls, and it's been claimed by people in a couple of different literatures, those who study the prehistory of writing, but also those who study the history of accounting, that these must have been in some way abstracted or recombinable forms of symbols, which may have helped people to track or retain or to spread or standardize important information. One historian of record keeping argues that sole reliance on mental record, like the unaided brain, will constrain societal expansion beyond a modest group size. Once you get beyond that size, as at Çatalhöyük, record keeping is more likely to emerge. But it turns out at Çatalhöyük that's actually unlikely. Now, this isn't a case of the absence of evidence, but actually there's an enormous trove of material traces which look like evidence for record keeping, for tokens, but probably aren't. Lucy Benison-Chapman systematically analyzes over 700 of these kinds of small clay objects found at Çatalhöyük, large numbers of spheres and smooth conical objects which have been unthinkingly called tokens in much previous work. But she finds no evidence that groups of these clay balls were ever intentionally crafted into ranges of clear geometric shapes. They're more likely to have been toys, perhaps unique ritual objects of some kind, at most simple counters. As Benison-Chapman puts it, there's no support for the use of small geometric clay objects as tokens, as symbols used to represent goods or produce, or to retain information for retrieval at a later point in time. So I was kind of stuck here, coming to my own hypothesis, because all of the natural ways I've looked for changes in material culture associated with changes in memory so far have come up with nothing concrete. The history houses and the clay balls, the tricky archaeological inferences. So I wanted to focus instead on the internalized wing of the shifting cognitive ecology. So, the resulting hypothesis. Both practical and social commitments in larger group settlements perhaps require more effective tracking over longer time periods. Plans bring agreements, promises, and contracts in their wake, operating over longer timescales than in a shared world. I need to state my hypothesis and I'll come to a halt. So, my claim is that gradually people internalized and deployed individualized practices and mechanisms of memory control and memory checking, enabling firmer attribution of beliefs to their own past experience. They started to track more precisely distinctions between self and other and between memory and imagination. They then transmitted the norms for making such attributions to future generations. So memory was still fragile, imperfect, selective, partial, but perhaps people come to share capacities to track past events more precisely. and regulatory ideals about the normative importance of so doing. Now, hypotheses like this about changes in memory in deep historical time periods, as I said, it's not about a single environmental transition. They're subtler processes of socio-cognitive tuning. A cognitive archaeology of memory precision must seek interacting and entangled factors which drive a partial, incomplete individualization of memory, where people gradually come to learn better to track specific past events, find more secure ways to stabilize constructive memory processes. So I've suggested that richer and more precise personal memories of specific past events around the Neolithic may have been demanded by new pressure on tracking events and social commitments over time, and supported, maybe indirectly, by new social and material memory norms, technologies and practices, and especially by new forms of enculturation, which permitted distinctive ways of deploying our basic memory capacity. My hope is that even if that hypothesis is wrong in detail, wrong in its periodization, it's at least the right kind of claim about cognitive change in deep human history. And it should, I hope, encourage other archaeologists to refine their searches for traces of specificity and accuracy in memory practices, perhaps especially to seek for evidence of cases of failed retrieval. It should encourage a wider spread of ethnographic and developmental research, identifying practices that require cross-temporal tracking of specific events, and attention to any cultural context where there may be different ways to manage confusion and distortion in our representations of the past, or less concern to distinguish personal memory from testimony. I mean, if David was at the fireworks, when and why does it matter how I know that? So thanks again to my many collaborators, to the IIS, to Hatfield, and to you for being here tonight.
Thank you, John, for a very wide-ranging and rich talk, which I'm sure will be plenty of questions for the remaining time. Yes?
So to what extent can we actually separate the sort of memory component to sort of the system that it serves? Because like, I would argue that when we're sort of studying, like memory exists to sort of make the system in the brain work really what they do. Like most things, most parts of the brain have a memory system, like perceptual system and memory. So even experiential quality, like remembering things in the past, that's a present thing that we feel. So I would sort of argue, to what extent are we actually looking here at memory, or are we actually looking at other places in the brain that have a memory component? If that makes sense.
I didn't get quite enough of the question, so
I mean sort of like, to what extent are we looking at the sort of cognitive change in memory, or rather are we looking at cognitive change of the systems which memory is serving?
Yeah.
In emotional.
Yeah, good. So I guess that goes to the question of whether memory was already fully formed before this period. I mean, that's where the analogy with literacy and numeracy is meant to bite. I mean, that needs to be further developed, obviously. But the idea is that the current circuitry that's involved in remembering is already pretty dynamic and pretty open, variable, and influenced by many other neural and environmental factors. So that, in a sense, you know, unless you deliberately say only one core necessary part of the system is memory, then you're already bringing context in. You're already bringing other contextual factors in the brain, and I guess the argument is then there's no reason to stop at the outside of the brain. But I mean, I am focusing more on memory practices perhaps than on the enduring systems. The point of the enculturation hypothesis is that there is a reliable way of training up children that produces more or less the same cognitive and presumably neural outcome as in the case of reading.
Yeah. I don't know if it's quick. So, what you say makes a lot of sense. You referred to our experimentalist colleagues earlier. What difference does your suggestions, does your framework make to the kinds of experiments that they should be doing? Or is that irrelevant?
No, not at all. I've been thinking about this quite a lot, and I'm not too worried if the answer turns out to be fairly minimal or modest, because the world is plural, promiscuous, and dappled, and needs to be, studied by lots of different people doing all kinds of different things. But so I guess I've got two more optimistic responses. One is just that, we've already been discussing this kind of thing, the range of differences across individuals and contexts in the way that these basic capacities and systems operate. I mean, first of all, across species, but then also across individuals, is really worth pushing on. And when we see what difference it makes to memory, for example, when there are radically different visual systems in play, that's worth looking at. But secondly, we just want to treat the entire brain as an interactive, dynamic system. And we've got to put all the components in there, you know, as with any group. The individuals do their own thing, and you can then ask for what each individual system brings. And, I also want to say, ask me again in 6 weeks' time.
I'll follow up, but I'll save it for dinner. Yeah.
Right, we've got a question from the people watching online here. So from Duncan Stibbard-Hakes says, among many contemporary forager groups, people may not learn to read or write and may habitually use tools of record keeping or numeracy. Some groups do not even use precise counting systems. However, there exist few barriers to those raised in different cognitive ecologies in communicating with people who live by foraging, or to understand how people think and feel. Similarly, people who are raised as foragers are able to navigate interactions with non-forager neighbours and thrive in cultural environments very different from the ones in which they were raised. So the question is, given that boundaries between different humans from different cognitive ecologies are easily traversable in both directions, are differences truly important?
Are differences trivial? Is the last question. Yeah, good, great. That's great. I had a chat about this the other day. Let me try to answer robustly. And say no, the differences are not trivial. I mean, you know, those who don't learn to read, for example, early, often find it much harder, right? And the ways in which the relevant neural resources get co-opted to learn to read seems maybe to be different in people who've learned to read later. This is not to say that there are incommensurable cognitive systems across people who don't share all of the cognitive capacities. And there's no reason to posit any sharp lines between people who can do certain things and people who can't do other things. We've all got different cognitive capacities, thank goodness. In the case of memory, I guess one thing I'm doing as well is sort of setting the bar high for what counts as full-scale personal remembering is also trying to divide it up into many component parts so that we think differently about the distinction between events I've experienced and those that I'm hearing about from testimony versus the distinction between memory and imagination. And people can learn and inhabit and deploy these differences in lots of different ways. And we all know people, right, who are much more prone to confuse something they've done with something somebody else has done than others, right? We haven't yet really systematically studied these kinds of individual differences. And I actually think that the individual differences may well be at least as systematic within single cultures as any cross-cultural differences. So I want to think in terms of a whole multi-dimensional space of different forms of remembering, which can vary separately. Yes, when you get certain cultural systems which just haven't got one particular technology which is necessary for the development of a certain kind of cognitive capacity, then you don't get that cognitive capacity, but that's not a value judgment.
Thanks for that. That's fascinating. I'm afraid I'm going to do the naughty thing of picking up on the side you made rather than the main point. But when talking about the situation prior to the full development of processing memory, you mentioned that the neurological processes might be in place, or would be in place, and that might be manifested in something like trauma memory,
Yeah.
which of course was an interest of mine, and I wondered if that suggested that trauma memory now is still outside the normal mechanisms of personal memory, that this might be more therapeutic or not.
Yeah, that's a good thing to pick up on. It was an aside because I don't have a clear and settled view. with regard to how things are now, I can see reasons to go either way in thinking of trauma and memory as involved as sort of quite separate processes, or to say, well, in many cases there's continuities. But with regard to the deep historical evidence, I raise that because the anthropologist Harvey Whitehouse has made a case that episodic memory is prior conceptually and historically to semantic memory. And what he means by that is kind of trauma memory. So he's talking specifically about these high intensity, emotionally or high arousal experiences of, say, an initiation ceremony. And he says, well, that's how memory got off the ground. And only later, when you got to larger societies, did people get dull semantic memories of facts. And I just think that's missing an important, a much larger array of forms of personal memory, which are much more quotidian, which are involved in our practices of interacting with each other. And so whether or not trauma memory is an entirely different process, all I want to say is that we, as well as looking at that, we've got to look over here where lots of memory suffer.
Based on your historical study of how memories have shaped the past, I'm wondering if you'd be able to think how our memory might change in the future, and how.
Good question. Yeah. You haven't had enough speculation. Let me say something about the present right first, and about our devices. So a thriving experimental research tradition in psychology and neuroscience nowadays is kind of arguing that the extent to which we've offloaded or outsourced memory to our devices is dangerous and is thinning our memory resources. I mean, this is continuous with the Google makes it stupid line. And as many of you will know, I mean, that's a very old concern that goes back to ancient worries about writing. And the answer is the same, that yes, of course, any technology can produce isolated troubles, but only if you think of the unit of analysis as the naked brain, as what's inside the skull alone, is it automatically a problem that we rely so much on our devices and indeed on other people. Every revolution in memory technologies has transformed human memory. Not because it's not only because it's transformed the way things work in the brain, but because we've enacted, entangled, and coupled differently with the different systems. So now, those of us who are more or less, I got completely lost using GPS today, but those of us who are more or less competent users of GPS, right? It's not necessarily that we're de-skilling, that we're thinning our cognitive maps, that our brains are no use anymore. It's that we're actually getting new skills, using, as long as these bloody systems are reliable, which is a big if, right? But we're getting new skills, and so that's the answer for the future as well. But we just don't know. It's not about technology advancing on its own. It's technology in social context. It's about the use by individuals and by groups. And so I think the picture of memory that I'm trying to draw as kind of intrinsically like plastic and intrinsically open means that things may well look very different. Why will we store nearly so much information up here? Those of us who were brought up before the internet, right? We've still got tendencies to hold stuff up here more than we need to now. Why would we do that? What's important now is navigating the sources of information, right? Tracking things like trust, right, and misinformation. So I just think there can't be a general answer because it just depends on what the technologies and practices will be.
John, so I'm probably a bit of a tangent here, but is there anything to be learned today from when cognitive memory disappears, i.e. in Alzheimer's people, and how basically their neurological and cognitive structures break down, and how we treat them, in how you then view the evolution of cognitive memory, say, in the Neolithic period, if you follow my train of thought? Because from my own experience just with my father, in the social structure that he then found himself when he just didn't function, I'm just wondering how that relates to more ancient cultures when they perhaps had less developed cognitive memory practices, if that makes sense.
Good. history, archaeological terms, there may be some people who have. I guess, again, I think that sort of the key things are about the social structure that surrounds the person who's suffering some neurological change. And a lot of the challenges for us in negotiating Alzheimer's and other dementias are encouraged, working around the medical model of seeing the single suffering brain as the only relevant factor and looking at the context within which the person exists, not just the other people, the family, but the environment and the practices, which are often spared a bit longer, retain a bit longer. Somebody would still know how to do to potter in the garden, to cook a dish while they don't know much about the rest of the life. So all I say is you've got to look at the changes in social structure to get at that, and I bet some archaeologists have looked at that. Some people
have. I've got to say, it's a pleasure to hear you work again, Prof.
Thank you.
I was worried for a while about what you meant by personal memory and just the brain, but then I realized that was a mistake to worry about that, because it's part of your theory that personal memory is, as it were, an artifact, that we get too simply, of various social practices. And that made me wonder, I wanted more specificity about the kinds of social practices that were involved in Neolithic times, perhaps, or both. Whether they need to say somewhere that certain kind of memory is an artifact of contracts, whether there's something in that. But then the memory that's involved in these memory practices for individual people must involve a practice of individual affection, love, something like this. So what are the practices, more specifically the practices that are involved here?
Great question. So let me pull out two bits of that. Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right that I operate with a pretty promiscuous or dissolute conception of episodic memory or personal memory. Not because I don't think there are kind of distinguishable systems and there's all kinds of double associations. Some people lose episodic memory and keep other kinds, but because, for the reasons I've gone over again and again, whatever systems there are just deeply permeated by all kinds of other stuff at the same time. So memory is not memory. What do you know of memory? You only memory know. And to understand, you've got to put it in rich context. But then your second question is precisely right. Well, how do we get at it then? Yes, we've got to look at practices and activities. So thinking of personal remembering as a process, as an activity, as something that is public, typically. And I think this is somewhere where there are very few good ideas around, and it is notable in anthropological, other ethnographic work, in developmental and cross-cultural psychology too, that despite, lots of fantastic work, it's very hard to pin down where to look. Right? Memory is often in use when it's not a topic, when it's not explicitly in question. Exactly to say, people are relying on their personal memories when they're just yammering about the past or expressing love or hatred to each other. Not when somebody says, do you remember what happened when you saw that car accident? And I guess your point about Nietzsche has been very much in my mind with this project, that the places to look are often to do with attributions of responsibility. And contracts are a really good case, because when somebody owes you, that's when you're motivated to remember that event in which you borrowed, you lent them something. If somebody's made a promise to you and they renege on it, you bloody well better have the ability to distinguish that promise you made, that promise they made from all the other promises that they've made. So again, we learn as kids to participate in these various practices, each of which has its own history, some of which are supported by more technologies and institutions than others. And we train ourselves, right? We soak those practices in and latch onto them and perform our roles according to the norm. So the last thing there is to since we've last talked about this, I guess I've come to think that there's a much heavier normative component to personal memory than I had previously thought. Yes, you can know everything you want about the neural circuits. You can agree all the facts of the matter about what's going on inside the case, but you can still disagree and reasonably disagree about whether somebody is actually remembering the past. the things that matter about that question might be, are we in a courtroom or are we in a pub? Because the criteria, the thresholds will be radically different. They're external different norms.
Earlier in the lecture, I believe you quoted someone, and their quote was, "We're natural-born cyborgs." I don't know if they were being metaphorical or something, but could you explain what they meant by that?
Yes. So that's Andy Clark, who's a cognitive philosopher now at Sussex. There's a book of that title, Natural Born Cyborgs 2003, which is about humans' technological nature. Yes, he uses a few cases that are more science fiction-like cases, or increasingly real, where actual technologies might be implanted or embedded in the skin, but that's not the idea. The idea is that way back in the kind of historical period I've been talking about here, we were already, in a slightly different sense, cyborgs, in that what a human being is, what human nature is, right? To reclaim the language of human nature is not just what he calls the biological skin bag, right? This is part of me, but I am also in my activities and my places, my land, my buildings, my devices, and my people. So I'm by nature interdependent. So I'm the kind of person who soaks up technologies. I mean, language is one early technology, right? But I soak up the ability now to use devices, or to use, bars, or to use libraries, or whatever it is. And in doing so, I change my own systems. And we all make the world. Another line from Clark is, we make the world smart so that we can be dumb in peace. Right? Our brains are basically sort of fairly dumb pattern matching engines, associative engines, but we collectively have been very clever because we made this and cathedrals and mobile phones, and that's good. Once we've got those in place, we latch onto them, and that's our cyborg nature.
Okay, I'm going to let John off the hook now and ask the Master of Capital College and the Climate to say a few words.
Very, very much indeed. I would say about the college, to those in the ISP, is absolutely great about having fellows in residence in college last year. We missed many things, but that was certainly quite nice, and seeing the life back in college with different people around is really wonderful. So it's great to have John and Christine in our midst. It's also, John also comes from a great IAS genealogy. My first term here 4 years ago was another psychologist from Macquarie University in Australia, Bill Thompson, who some of you will know here, and that was a wonderful experience. So when John came, and I know you had a virtual drink before you arrived to check out what Hatfield place that you were coming to. It's really lovely to know that Bill and Pat are all part of this too. This is the first time we've held the lecture in this setting. It was slightly easier under our semi-COVID still arrangements. Those of you who've been in our other room, I'd be interested to know what you feel about it. I have to say the kind of roundness of it feels very nice. This was built soon after the college was founded, and I'm sure has many memories with this building, some of them inscribed on the walls. Certainly no memories of the past year. This had drama rehearsals, music rehearsals, I was playing cello, Stevie, wasn't it? It was a soup kitchen at some point to deliver meals to all our residents around college last year, and then turned into a pink-lit silent disco. So maybe somewhere in here, the memories have been kind of talk. As Rob said, John is an interdisciplinary empire, so we've been taking across an enormous range of space and time aspects of memory in just a short time, with really fascinating ideas about enculturation of memory and how that would vary through different social, ecological, material settings and times, which I'm sure has left all of us a great deal to think about. Whether more personally or wider, I was this afternoon writing a chapter for the Festschrift of a colleague, a friend, and I've been sitting here thinking, why did I remember these very specific occasions and cultural nuances? And also, I don't think Fireworks Night will ever seem quite the same again as it moves next week. John, you said human sciences are hard. I was reminded, Rob and I were postgrads together. We were very supervised by saying that in his inaugural lecture referred to there being hard sciences and so-called soft sciences, or as he was saying, hard sciences and difficult sciences. It's a much better spectrum. And I think you have, with great lightness of touch, led us through really difficult areas of sequencing, absolutely.